The last time I saw my mother's boyfriend standing in our kitchen, it was a Saturday morning in early March, the kind of gray Ohio morning where the light barely makes it through the windows. He was wearing my father's watch, not a watch like my father's actual watch. The old Seiko with the scratched face and the worn leather band that my dad had replaced twice over the years because the clasp kept loosening, but he refused to just buy a new one. He used to joke that he and that watch had been through too much together. And there was Gerald, standing at the counter by the coffee maker, right in the spot where my dad used to lean every morning while he waited for the pot to fill, drinking from my father's old Bengal's mug, wearing my father's watch on his wrist like it had always been his. Something very quiet shifted inside me that morning, something that didn't shift back. He looked over at me and smiled, that wide, careful smile he always did, and I smiled right back. Because by then I already knew things about him that my mother didn't, things I'd been sitting with for weeks, things that would eventually pull everything apart. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I need to take you back a bit because none of this makes sense unless you understand what my family looked like before it broke. We lived in a small house in Fairfield, just north of Cincinnati. 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a garage my dad kept saying he was going to convert into a workshop but never did. My parents got married in 1999. My mom was 23. My dad was 25. They'd met through a mutual friend at some 4th of July cookout, and my mom always said she knew he was the one because he spent half the party playing with someone else's dog instead of trying to impress anyone. That was my dad. Quiet. Steady. Not the kind of guy who filled up a room, but the kind of guy you noticed was missing when he wasn't in it. They were married for 14 years, and I want to be honest here, it wasn't some fairy tale. They argued about money sometimes. My mom got frustrated that my dad worked too much. My dad got quiet when he was upset, which made my mom more frustrated because she couldn't read him. But it worked. Saturday mornings, my dad would make these terrible pancakes that were always either burnt or raw in the middle, and my mom would eat them anyway and say they were fine. He coached my soccer team in 5th and 6th grade even though he knew almost nothing about soccer. He'd just stand on the sideline yelling things like spread out and keep moving, which, looking back, is honestly pretty solid life advice even if it didn't help us win any games. My mom ran the house. Bills, groceries, appointments, school stuff. She had this way of keeping everything organized that I didn't appreciate until I was much older and realized how hard that actually is. They worked. Maybe not beautifully, but they worked. And then, around the time I turned 13, they stopped working. I still don't know exactly what happened between them. I've asked both of them at different points and gotten 2 versions that are close enough to overlap, but far enough apart that I know neither one is the full truth. I think that's just how marriages end sometimes. Not with one big thing, but with 100 small ones that pile up until the pile is taller than the love. I came home from school on a Tuesday in October, 8th grade, and my dad was sitting on the edge of my bed. He had a duffel bag on the floor next to him, the green one he usually took to the gym. The room smelled like his deodorant, that Old Spice stuff he'd used for as long as I could remember. He looked tired. Not sad, exactly. Just tired in a way I hadn't seen before. He told me he and Mom had decided it would be better if he stayed somewhere else for a while. He said sometimes 2 people can love each other and still not be able to live in the same house. I remember staring at the duffel bag while he talked, noticing that the zipper was half open and I could see a rolled-up pair of jeans and his phone charger sticking out. I didn't cry. I don't think I fully understood what was happening yet. I just nodded and said okay, and he hugged me and he left. I stood at my bedroom window and watched him put the bag in the trunk of his Camry and pull out of the driveway. He sat in the car for a minute before he drove off. I don't know what he was doing. Maybe he was just sitting there. I think about that sometimes. The divorce went through about 6 months later, right around the end of my 8th grade year. My mom kept the house. My dad moved into an apartment complex off Hamilton Avenue about 20 minutes away. It was a small place. 1 bedroom, a kitchen that was basically a hallway, and a living room where he put this second-hand couch that was too big for the space. He taped a photo of me on the fridge with a magnet from a pizza place. We had a custody arrangement, every other weekend with him, Wednesday dinners every week. And I'll say this, those Wednesdays became the most important part of my week. My dad never missed one. Not once. He'd pull up in front of the house at 5:30, always a couple minutes early, and we'd drive to this diner called Rosie's off Route 4 that had these red vinyl booths and a jukebox that hadn't worked in years. He always ordered the same thing, turkey club with fries, and he'd sit across from me and ask me about school, about my friends, about whatever book I was reading. He had this thing where he'd put his phone face down on the table as soon as we sat down, every time. Like he was making a point. Like he was saying, this hour is yours and nothing else matters. I didn't think much of it then. I was 13, 14. I took it for granted the way kids take everything for granted. But I need you to remember that detail because later, when everything changed, it became one of the things I held onto the hardest. About a year after the divorce, probably around the fall of my freshman year of high school, I started noticing things about my mom. She was different, not in a big, obvious way, but in the small ways that you only pick up on when you live with someone. She started doing her hair on weekday mornings, which she never used to bother with. She bought new clothes, a couple of blouses, and a pair of boots that were nicer than anything she normally wore. On Friday nights, she'd tell me she was going out with a friend, but she'd be wearing this perfume I didn't recognize, something floral and kind of heavy, not the light vanilla stuff she usually wore. And she started locking her phone. That was the one that really stood out to me. My mom had never been secretive about her phone. She'd leave it on the kitchen counter, hand it to me to look something up, whatever. Now suddenly it had a passcode. I didn't say anything about any of it. At first I thought, okay, maybe she's just, I don't know, trying to feel good about herself after the divorce. That made sense. I told myself it was fine, but something about the phone thing nagged at me. My father used to say I had a habit of noticing the things people were trying to keep quiet. He'd say it in this proud way, like it was a skill. He didn't know how much I'd end up needing it. She introduced him on a Sunday afternoon in November. His name was Gerald. She told me the night before that a friend was coming for dinner, which, looking back, was a strange way to frame it. He showed up around 4. I remember because I was in the living room doing homework and heard the doorbell, and I looked at the clock on the cable box. He was tall, maybe 6'1", clean-shaven, wearing a button-down shirt tucked into khakis like he was going to a job interview. My mom opened the door, and the way she smiled at him, it was different from how she smiled at her actual friends. It was nervous, almost girlish. He stepped inside and she introduced us. He walked over and shook my hand and held it a little too long, looking me right in the eyes with this warm expression that felt, I don't know how to explain it, practiced. Like he'd thought about how to do it beforehand. Maybe I was overthinking it, maybe that's just how some people are, but something about it didn't sit right with me. At dinner he complimented my mom's cooking 3 separate times. Once when the food came out, once halfway through, once at the end. And each time he'd say it loud enough that the whole table heard it, then glance over at me to make sure I was registering what a thoughtful, appreciative guy he was. He asked me about school, too. What subjects I liked, whether I played any sports. His voice sounded interested enough, but his eyes kept drifting sideways to my mom, checking her reaction, watching to see if she was noticing how good he was being with me. That's the thing I remember most clearly from that first night. Not what he said, but where his eyes went. People who are genuinely kind to you don't look around to see if anyone's watching them do it. I noticed that, but I was 14. And who takes a 14-year-old seriously when they say they have a bad feeling about a grown man who's being perfectly polite? Over the next few months, Gerald started showing up more and more. At first, it was just weekends. He'd come over on Saturday, hang around all day, stay for dinner. Then he started appearing on weekday evenings. I'd come home from school and his gray Nissan Altima would be in the driveway. Then around February or March of that year, I started noticing his things in the house. A brown leather jacket on the coat hook by the front door, a razor and a can of shaving cream on the bathroom shelf next to my mom's stuff, a pair of dress shoes by the entrance, size 11, sitting right where my dad's work boots used to be. My mother never sat me down and said, "Gerald is moving in." There was no conversation, no asking how I felt about it. It just happened slowly, one object at a time, like she was hoping I wouldn't notice if it was gradual enough. And honestly, I think she knew that if she'd asked me directly, I would have said no. I would have said it wasn't his house. I would have said a lot of things. So she didn't ask. Here's where I need to tell you something that becomes important later. Once Gerald was settled in, really settled, toothbrush in the bathroom, his coffee in the cabinet, my mother started doing something I didn't have a word for at the time. She started erasing my father, not angrily, not with any kind of dramatic declaration, but quietly, methodically. It started with the photographs. I came home from school one afternoon, mid-March maybe, and the family portrait that had hung in the hallway since I was in elementary school was gone. It had been replaced with this generic framed print of a mountain landscape, the kind of thing you'd see in a dentist's office. I went through the house that evening. Every photo that had my dad in it, the one from my parents' anniversary dinner, the one of the 3 of us at Kings Island, the one of my dad holding me as a baby, they were all gone. I found them 2 days later when I went into the garage looking for my bike pump. They were in a cardboard box on the shelf behind the paint cans. Stacked face down, like they were something to be ashamed of. I stood there in the garage staring at that box for a long time. I didn't take them out. I didn't say anything to my mom, but I remember thinking she didn't throw them away. She hid them, and I didn't know what to do with that. Then Then the Wednesday dinners stopped. And this is the part that still makes me angry if I sit with it too long. My dad didn't cancel them. My mother started making me unavailable. She scheduled an orthodontist appointment on a Wednesday. Then the next week it was a tutoring session for math, which I didn't need because I had a B+ in math. Then there was some school activity she'd signed me up for without telling me. Every single conflict landed on Wednesday, right in the window when my dad was supposed to pick me up. The first time it happened, I thought it was a coincidence. The second time, I wasn't sure. By the third time, I knew. When my dad called to try to reschedule, my mom wouldn't pick up. He'd text her and she'd respond hours later with these short, flat messages. "Can't do Thursday either. We'll figure something out." But she never figured anything out. She was building a wall between me and my father, and she was doing it one appointment, one excuse, one unanswered text at a time, so slowly that she thought I wouldn't see it. But I saw it. I saw every single piece of it, and Gerald helped. That's the part that still makes my stomach turn when I think about it, even now. He didn't just sit back and benefit from my dad being pushed out. He leaned into it. He started saying things like, "In my house, we clean up after ourselves," or "Under my roof, this is how we do things." My roof, his house, like he'd built the place himself, like he'd made 14 years of mortgage payments, like my father's name had never been on the deed. He'd correct me at the dinner table in this calm, authoritative tone, the kind of voice that sounds reasonable to anyone listening, but that you can feel in your chest because you know it hasn't been earned. If we were out somewhere, at the grocery store or picking up takeout, he'd put his hand on my shoulder and steer me around like I was his kid, and anyone looking would just see a normal father and son. And my mom would watch this happen, and she'd get this look on her face, this grateful, relieved expression like Gerald was doing her the biggest favor in the world by playing a role that nobody had asked him to play. Looking back, I think she wanted it to be real so badly that she convinced herself it was. But here's what neither of them knew. And I've never talked about this publicly until now, not in any real detail. I never stopped talking to my father, not for one single day. When the Wednesday dinners got canceled, I started calling my dad from my bedroom at night. I'd wait until my mom and Gerald were downstairs watching TV, usually around 9 or 9:30, and I'd call him. We'd talk for 20-30 minutes, about everything and about nothing, about school, about what I'd had for lunch, about whatever was on my mind, just normal stuff. The kind of stuff we used to talk about at Rosie's diner. But then my mom started checking my phone. I don't know if Gerald suggested it or if she thought of it on her own, but one evening she asked to see my call history. I'd already deleted the calls to my dad, but it shook me. After that, I got more careful. My dad went to a Walmart in Middletown and bought a prepaid phone, one of those cheap flip phones with the minutes on it, and he mailed it to my friend Tyler's house in a padded envelope with no return address. Tyler gave it to me at school the next day in the cafeteria, wrapped in a hoodie inside his backpack. I kept it in my room, tucked inside an old shoebox on the top shelf of my closet behind some basketball stuff I never used. Then Gerald installed some kind of parental monitoring software on the home computer. I don't know what exactly it tracked, maybe browsing history, maybe keystrokes. He told my mom it was for my safety, which is the kind of word people use when what they really mean is control. So I started using the computers at the public library on Pleasant Avenue after school. I'd walk there, send my dad an email, then walk home. And when my mother called my school and told them that my father was no longer authorized for pickup, that was a Wednesday in April. I remember because it had rained all day and my shoes were soaked when I got home. My dad and I came up with a new system. He started parking his Camry on Benton Street, 2 blocks west of the school, behind the Church of Christ. And every day after the final bell, I'd walk east toward the main pickup area like normal, then cut through the parking lot behind the gym, cross Benton, and get in his car. We'd sit there for 15-20 minutes sometimes, windows up, heat on because it was still cold that spring. And we'd just talk, sometimes about important things, sometimes about nothing. He'd always have a granola bar or a pack of crackers in the glove box for me because he knew I was always hungry after school. We did this for over 2 years. Over 2 years of phone calls and library emails and walks to Benton Street. And my mother and Gerald had absolutely no idea. Or at least I thought they didn't, but I'll come back to that. I want to be clear about something. My father never once asked me to lie. He never told me to keep secrets. Every few weeks he'd say the same thing. He'd say, "If this ever gets too heavy, if it ever feels wrong, you can tell your mom everything. I'll deal with whatever comes." He meant it too. I could hear it in his voice, but I didn't want to tell her because I'd watched what she was doing. I'd seen the photos go into the box. I'd seen the Wednesdays disappear. And I understood even at 14, even at 15, that if she found out I was still talking to my dad, she'd find a way to end it for good. Maybe she'd take the phone. Maybe she'd move us somewhere else. Gerald had already been talking about how it might be nice to start fresh, somewhere new, maybe down in Kentucky. And I knew in my gut that if we moved, I'd lose my dad completely. So I protected the only thing that still felt real. And I did it with more focus and discipline than I put into anything else in my life at that time. More than school, more than sports, more than anything. During those calls, the late-night ones on the prepaid phone, my dad and I talked about a lot of things. But we also talked about Gerald. And it was during one of these conversations, I think it was around August, maybe September, about 8 months after Gerald had fully moved in, that my father told me something that changed the entire picture. He was quiet for a moment on the phone, the way he got when he was choosing his words carefully, and then he said he'd been looking into some things. He said he wasn't trying to be vindictive, he wanted me to know that. He said he just had a feeling that something wasn't right with Gerald and he'd followed the feeling. He had a friend, a guy named Dan he'd worked with at the county assessor's office who had access to certain public records. And through Dan, and through some careful searching, my dad had learned that Gerald's last name, the one my mother knew him by, wasn't his original name. He'd changed it legally about 6 years before he showed up in Fairfield. Before that, he'd lived in a town called Greensburg, Indiana, about an hour and a half west of us. And in Greensburg, Gerald had a different life. A wife, a stepchild, a whole family, and a restraining order. My dad read me parts of it over the phone. I was sitting on the floor of my closet with the door shut, the prepaid phone pressed to my ear, and my hands were shaking, not from fear exactly, from the feeling of something clicking into place. The restraining order had been filed by Gerald's ex-wife, and it described a pattern of behavior that wasn't violent in the way most people think of violence. He never hit her. He never threw anything. What he did was quieter and in some ways worse because it was harder to point at and say, look, there it is. He isolated her, systematically. Over the course of about 3 years, he convinced her to close her own bank account and merge everything into a joint account that he managed. He moved them from her hometown to a city 2 hours away where she didn't know anyone. He screened her phone calls. He'd answer her cell when her sister or her friends called and tell them she was sleeping or busy or not feeling well. He intercepted her mail, actual physical mail. He opened her letters and threw away the ones he didn't want her to see. And piece by piece, week by week, he built a world around her where he was the only voice she heard. When she finally got out, it took her 2 years to put her life back together. The restraining order was granted and Gerald didn't fight it. He just vanished, changed his name, left the state, and started looking for someone new. I sat in that closet for a long time after my dad stopped talking. I could hear Gerald's voice downstairs, something about a show he wanted to watch, and my mom laughing at something he said. And I felt this cold, heavy thing settle in the center of my chest. Because I recognized every single thing my father had just described. The bank accounts. Gerald had convinced my mom to add him to hers just 2 months earlier. He'd sat at our kitchen table and talked about how it just made things easier logistically, and she'd agreed. The isolation. My mom's friend Karen, who used to come over for coffee almost every week, hadn't been to the house in months. My Aunt Lisa, my mom's sister, had stopped calling after some blow-up that my mom described as a misunderstanding over holiday plans. But now I wasn't so sure it was a misunderstanding. Now I was thinking about whether Gerald had been in the room when that phone call happened, and whether the argument had really been about holiday plans at all. The monitoring, the software on the computer, the checking of my phone. The way Gerald always seemed to know who my mom had talked to and what they'd said. It was all there, every piece of it. He wasn't just replacing my father in our house. He was rebuilding the exact same structure he'd built before in another state with another family, and my mother was already inside it. She just couldn't see the walls yet. I carried that knowledge for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of sitting at the dinner table across from Gerald while he talked about his day and passed the salt and smiled at my mother like everything was normal. 3 weeks of watching him rest his hand on her arm while they watched TV. 3 weeks of hearing him say things like, we should really think about getting a bigger place, and knowing exactly what that meant. He wanted to move us, relocate, cut the last threads connecting my mother to anyone who might notice what was happening. I was 15 years old and I was carrying something that felt too big for my body. I'd lie in bed at night staring at the ceiling and think I have to do something. And then I'd think, but what if I do it wrong? What if I tell Mom and she doesn't believe me? What if she chooses him? My dad and I talked about this a lot. He told me, and I remember his exact words, he said, we can't rush this. If we go to your mother with this now, he'll deny everything. He'll say we made it up. He'll tell her we're trying to destroy her happiness, and she'll believe him, not because she loves him more than you, but because believing us means admitting she made a mistake and people will put themselves through hell before they'll do that. So we waited. My dad kept documenting everything. Every time I called him, he'd write down what I told him, dates, times, details. He kept it all in a yellow legal pad that he stored in the drawer of his nightstand. He said we'd know when the time was right. He said we'd feel it. And while we waited, I watched. I watched Gerald go with my mom to the bank and come back with paperwork. I watched him take her phone off the counter one evening when it rang and say, "She's in the shower, can I take a message?" And then never pass the message along. I watched him suggest, casually over meatloaf one Thursday, that maybe my mom should quit her part-time job at the dental office because he was making enough for both of them and wouldn't it be nice for her to be home more. I watched the circle get smaller. And every night around 10:15, after they'd gone to bed and I could hear the TV click off downstairs, I'd pull the prepaid phone out of the shoebox and call my dad and tell him what I'd seen. The confrontation happened on a Saturday morning, early March. I'd come downstairs around 8:30. The house smelled like coffee and toast. Gerald was standing at the kitchen counter, and that's when I saw it. My father's Seiko watch on his wrist. The one with the scratched crystal and the leather band that was slightly too loose. My dad had left it behind when he moved out because my mom had told him she'd gotten rid of it, thrown it away. But she hadn't. She'd kept it somewhere, and now Gerald was wearing it, standing in my father's kitchen, drinking from my father's mug, wearing my father's watch, and something inside me just, I don't know, finished. Not broke, finished. Like a timer reaching zero. I stood in the doorway and looked at his wrist and I said, quiet, flat, almost matter-of-fact, "That's my dad's watch." He looked down at it, then back up at me with that smile, that same practiced warmth from the first night, and he said, "Your mom gave it to me." Just like that, like it was nothing. Like it was an old watch with no history attached to it. My mom was by the stove and she turned around and said, "It was just sitting in a drawer collecting dust. No sense letting it go to waste." I don't know if it was the word waste or the way she said it, like 14 years of my father's life was clutter to be cleared out, but that was the moment. I set my glass of orange juice down on the counter and I looked at Gerald and I said, "I know who you are." The kitchen went still, not quiet, still. Gerald's face didn't crumble or go red, it froze like a screen that just stopped loading. My mom turned fully around and said, "What are you talking about?" And I started talking. Slowly. Calmly, I don't know where the calm came from, maybe from 2 years of practice. Maybe from all those nights on the phone with my dad, going over the facts, making sure I had them straight. I told her Gerald's real name. I told her about Greensburg, Indiana. I told her about the first wife. I told her about the restraining order, the bank accounts, the isolation, the intercepted mail. I told her about the name change. I told her every single thing, piece by piece, and while I talked, I watched her face change. At first, she looked annoyed, like I was acting out, then confused. Then something shifted behind her eyes and I could see the gears catching, the connections forming, the bank account, the friends who'd stopped calling, the argument with Aunt Lisa, the job Gerald wanted her to quit. I watched her arrive at the same place I'd arrived 3 weeks ago and I watched the color leave her face. Gerald stood up from the counter slowly. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't slam anything. He turned to my mom with this look of hurt sincerity, eyes soft, brow furrowed, and he said, "Are you really going to let your kid do this to us? Your kid, not my name, not even your son. Your kid," like I was a problem, an obstacle between him and what he wanted, and my mother heard it. I know she heard it because her head tilted slightly, the way it does when she's really processing something, and she looked at him differently than I'd ever seen her look at him before. The warmth was gone. What was left was something clear and tired and very, very awake. She said, "I think you need to leave, Gerald." He didn't leave right away. He did what I imagine he'd done before in Indiana when things started slipping. He shifted. He tried tenderness. He reached for her hand and said, "Sweetheart, come on, you know me." She pulled her hand back. Then he tried guilt. He said he'd given up so much to be with her. He said he'd built something here and she was throwing it away over accusations from a teenager. Then he said, "You're going to regret this. You're going to be alone." And I could feel the weight of that word, alone, hanging in the kitchen like he'd swung it at her. He let it sit. He wanted her to feel it. And then my mother, my quiet, careful, non-confrontational mother, looked at him and said, "I managed a household and raised a kid by myself for a year before you ever showed up. I think I'll be fine." She said it without raising her voice. She said it like she was reading a fact off a piece of paper. And then she said, "I need you to go. Now." He went. Here's the part I didn't see coming. After Gerald left, after my mom changed the locks that same afternoon and boxed up his things and had Aunt Lisa drive them to a storage unit across town, after she called the bank and removed his name from her account, after all of that, she sat down at the kitchen table across from me. It was late, maybe 9 o'clock. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been in a long time. She looked at me for a moment, really looked, and she said, "How long have you been talking to your dad?" My stomach dropped. But her voice wasn't angry. It was soft, almost resigned. And I realized, sitting there under the fluorescent light with the faucet dripping behind her because it always dripped and Gerald had never fixed it despite saying he would, I realized she'd known. Not the details, not the prepaid phone or the walks to Benton Street or the library emails. But she'd known, somewhere underneath everything, that I hadn't let go of my father, and she hadn't stopped it. She told me, and I think she was being honest, that part of her was relieved. She said that even while she was going through the motions of pushing my dad out, scheduling over Wednesdays, not answering his calls, there was a part of her that couldn't fully do it. She said she'd come into my room one afternoon to put laundry away and seen the flip phone in my shoebox and knew immediately what it was. And she'd closed the box and put it back and walked out. She said she noticed that my walks home from school took 45 minutes longer than they should, and she never asked why. She said she didn't know what to do with any of it, so she just let it be. And I think looking back now, that's the thing that makes me feel the most complicated about my mother. She wasn't strong enough to stop what Gerald was doing, not while she was inside it. But she was strong enough, or maybe just human enough, to leave a crack in the wall. A crack just wide enough for me to keep reaching through to my dad. I don't say that to excuse what she let happen. I say it because I think it tells you something true about how manipulation works. It doesn't turn good people into monsters. It buries them. It piles layers of control and self-doubt and dependency on top of who they really are until they can barely move. But the person underneath is still in there, still making small, quiet choices, still leaving cracks. My parents didn't get back together. I want to be upfront about that because I know it's what some people want to hear and it's not what happened. My dad stayed in his apartment on Hamilton Avenue. My mom stayed in the house in Fairfield, but things changed. The Wednesday dinners came back. My dad started showing up to my basketball games again. He and my mom started communicating like normal people, texting about scheduling, talking on the phone when something came up with school. It wasn't warm exactly, but the ice was gone, and my mom started putting herself back together. Aunt Lisa started coming to the house on Sundays again. Karen came back for coffee. My mom went back to her job at the dental office, and about 6 months after Gerald left, she started seeing a therapist. Nobody told her to. She just said she wanted to understand how it happened. How she'd let someone take her life apart one piece at a time without seeing it until her 15-year-old son had to lay it out for her in her own kitchen. I'm 23 now. I work in Columbus, and I drive down to see my dad in Fairfield once or twice a month. We still go to Rosie's sometimes, even though they remodeled it and it doesn't look the same. He still puts his phone face down on the table. My mom and I have a different relationship now. It's good mostly, but there's something underneath it that we both know is there. A scar that healed but left a mark. We don't talk about Gerald, almost never. But my dad still checks every few months through Dan or through public records, because Gerald is out there somewhere. Men like him don't stop. They just move. They find a new town, a new woman, a new kitchen to stand in, a new life to quietly dismantle. And that thought sits with me, not as fear. As something more like a weight I choose to carry. Because I think the people who learn to see the patterns have a responsibility to point them out. Not loudly, not with anger, but clearly. The way you tell someone there's a crack in their foundation. You don't scream about it. You just make sure they see it before the house comes down. My dad said something to me once during one of those late-night calls when I was 15, sitting on the floor of my closet in the dark with the flip phone warm against my ear and my heart beating too fast. He said, "The most dangerous people aren't the ones who yell. They're the ones who whisper. A whisper gets closer to you than a scream ever could." I think about that all the time. I think about Gerald's quiet voice and his clean shirts and his careful handshake, and the way he always checked to make sure someone was watching him be kind. I think about how convincing it all looked from the outside. And I think about my mother, standing in her kitchen in Fairfield, Ohio, on a gray Saturday morning, looking at a man who'd slowly taken over her entire life, and telling him in a voice that didn't shake that she'd survive without him. She did survive. We all did. But I don't think survival is really the point of this. The point is that sometimes the thing that saves a family isn't big or dramatic. It isn't a courtroom or a police report or someone kicking down a door. Sometimes it's just a kid with a cheap prepaid phone sitting in a dark closet, calling his dad every night to say, "I'm still here. I still hear you. I'm not letting go." Sometimes the thing that saves you is so quiet that nobody else even sees it happening. And maybe that's the most important kind of saving there is. The kind that doesn't need anyone to watch. The kind that just keeps going night after night until the moment it's finally needed. My mother still has my dad's watch. She took it back the day Gerald left, unclasped it from the kitchen counter where he'd set it down on his way out and put it in a small blue box in her dresser drawer. As far as I know, it's still there. She never gave it back to my dad. He never asked for it. I think they both understand that it isn't really about the watch. It's about what it stands for. A history that somebody tried to erase. A connection that somebody tried to cut. And the quiet, stubborn, sometimes clumsy refusal of two imperfect people to let that happen. If you're listening to this and you're in a situation where someone is slowly making your world smaller, where the people you love are getting harder to reach and the person beside you is becoming the only voice in the room, I need you to hear me. That is not love. Love does not isolate. Love does not monitor. Love does not replace. Love makes room. It always makes room. And if the room you're standing in keeps getting smaller, it's not because the world is shrinking. It's because someone is building walls around you and calling it home. Pay attention to the people who make room and hold on to them, even if you have to hide a phone in a shoebox to do it.